If you're a fan of the Legend of Zelda games for the Game Boy Color, you are eating shockingly well in 2026. Much ado was already made about the indie darling Mina the Hollower, which borrows a lot of aesthetic and control ideas from those old Zelda games, while adding in combat that feels a little bit more like a modern Souls-like type game. But Isle of Reveries is strictly trying to be a Game Boy Color Zelda game, and I think it succeeds at this pretty well. It's got the same type of dungeon layouts, the same type of attacks, the same type of puzzle solving, and it's kind of hard for me to imagine that fans of those games would not like this one at all. It goes a little bit deeper into its storytelling, it has some darker edges to it in spite of its very cutesy art style, and it's a bit more expansive. It kind of fixes certain things about those old Zelda Game Boy Color games, not only in that it gives you way more buttons to play with, since the expectation is that you'll be using a modern controller when you play this game, and so you're not going to be constantly switching items back and forth, at least not yet. I don't know if this will become a problem later on, but it seems like the game is trying to be a little bit more robust with its controls. It also introduces more than one new item in the first dungeon, and it has you using 3 different new abilities over the course of navigating this dungeon and beating its boss, and so it doesn't feel nearly as obvious exactly what's going to have to be done as it does in a Zelda game, where it tends to be that the new item you get pretty much solves all of the dungeon's puzzles. It also has somewhat higher expectations of you going back through the dungeon and finding different things that maybe you missed when you were first passing by them. It doesn't feel as much like rooms are kind of useless once you've been through them as it does in some of the Zelda games, and when the room is a one-time thing, it's usually stationed kind of out of the way so that you wouldn't have cause to go back through it anyways. At first, I wasn't sure about this game, if it really added anything to the formula that made it better than just going back and playing a Zelda game, but once you get the sort of main power-up from this dungeon, which allows you to clone any object and then recreate it in a new space, I thought this was an original enough power, used in interesting enough ways, that it felt like a worthy addition to the formula. I was kind of surprised it wasn't something that had already been in one of those Zelda games. And looking at the trailer on Steam, it is evident that there will be some interesting and original ideas that might make this game more compelling than just a pure clone of old Zelda. It also has a somewhat more interesting story in that you start off the game with your main character and their little brother, and the little brother is talking about their mom who seemingly died, and basically there had been this mythos that these people called pilgrims who go off in search of making a wish, usually trying to bring someone back to life, it seems like. These pilgrims become stars in the night sky, and your little brother believes that the stars in the sky are actually everybody, it's not just the pilgrims, and that the stars are there to remind you of people so that you don't feel as though you're all alone without them, and that this is why it's not necessary to make a wish, because the game is asking you the question, like, why do I deserve to come back as opposed to anybody else? And over the course of your pilgrimage, you're traveling with a few other people who mostly die on your way through the first dungeon, and the one character who is very compelled by wanting to make their wish, who commands you throughout the first stage, kind of comes off as annoying, and like, even though this is supposed to be my friend, they're very pushy and they don't want to get their own hands dirty, they want you to do things for them, and it kind of feels like making a wish is not really a good thing. So there's kind of this dark fairy tale atmosphere to the game. It feels good to slash your sword, it feels good to use the items and navigate the dungeon, the enemy designs are cool, the overall aesthetics look good if you like this kind of low-bit Game Boy Color aesthetic. Before I go praising this game too much or telling you that it's an absolute recommendation, there were some things that really frustrated me while I was playing this demo. The biggest one is how heavily it uses jumping as a function, because jumping in this game is frustrating and uninteresting. It's frustrating because your jump has like a slight delay on it, and a lot of the time I couldn't really gauge when am I supposed to hit the jump button. Should I hit jump and then move? Can I hit jump like right on the last bit? I found myself falling into pits just all of the time, and you take a little bit of damage when you fall into a pit, and there is a jumping puzzle in the boss fight, and it is by far the most frustrating thing about this boss, especially because it's very easy to get hit right after falling into a pit or right before falling into a pit, and therefore taking damage twice back to back. I hated jumping in this game. It frustrated me almost every time I came across something I had to jump over, and especially during the boss fight. I played through this demo twice. The first time I played, it took me about an hour and 7 minutes. The second time, it took me 44 minutes. I would have cleared the second time in like 35 minutes if not for how many times I died against this boss, mostly from falling into the goddamn pits. Because it's really hard to gauge distance, especially vertically crossing these pits. It did not feel like an interesting skill challenge. It just felt frustrating because even if you get good at timing the jump, all you're doing is leaping a one-block pit. It is not an interesting challenge. It's not fun or engaging, and it is surprising to me how much of it you do in this first stage. If this is something that persists throughout the game where there's lots of jumping challenges, I could see getting even more frustrated and really getting turned off of the game if I have to jump all the time. And one last thing I needed to complain about with the boss fight is that there was a moment where I fell into a pit, respawned at the entrance of the room, and I was overlapping with one of the enemies and got hurt. That was bullshit. I really like the feel of using the sword, but I do kind of wish you could use it a little bit faster, like how in Zelda games you can pretty much slash as fast as you can tap the button. In this game, your slash is a little bit slower. This didn't necessarily bother me, but a lot of the times enemies kind of move at inconsistent speed, and it could be that I slash them once and then they immediately run into me, and it felt weird trying to figure out what's the right position to deal with enemies. There are a lot of rooms that just heal you after combat's over. Like, I want to say 6-7 times throughout the first dungeon, after you clear a room, a fairy just appears and restores your health, and it kind of feels like this was there to make up for not having well-balanced combat. It feels like this game was more forwardly considering how to develop the puzzles and the layouts of the dungeons, and combat always just kind of felt like, I don't know, aim at the enemy and hit slash and then get healed up from whatever damage they might have done to you, because they often drop hearts. You can gain hearts from all kinds of things you can destroy in the level, and it's throwing fairies at you. I think this would have been a tremendously harder dungeon if it wasn't constantly healing you, just because the enemies have kind of an advantage over you in terms of their movement, but it also felt like there wasn't really a tactical way to approach dealing with them, and I could be wrong about this. It just didn't come off that there was a cleaner way to fight than what I was doing. And yes, I do think Legend of Zelda has much cleaner combat, much more consideration for the flow of combat and positioning. Enemies move in more predictable ways with more obvious patterns in Zelda. Even in Zelda 1, where the combat is quite difficult, it is also something where you learn how to do it, and there's a very particular rhythm and movement to the combat, and this game doesn't feel like it captures that. Another thing is that even though I think the music is pretty good in this game, it is very short and repetitive. The dungeon song is stuck in my head, and I don't dislike it as a song, but there is so little to it, and you will hear it a lot of times before you're done with the dungeon. Now, I have the same complaint about Zelda, especially Zelda 1, but it's one of those places where I think it could have improved on what Zelda does. I think if we had a longer dungeon song, it would be nice, and weirdly enough, the music does change when you're on the outside of the dungeon, but there's literally only one screen where you're outside within the dungeon, and it's very strange to go from the music kind of changing up a little bit right back into the thick of it sounding the same it has the whole time. I also find it fascinating that one of the basic enemies in this dungeon looks exactly like a Wall Master from Zelda, but doesn't actually function like a Wall Master from Zelda. Another thing I found a little strange is that you unlock these like journal entries about different characters when you talk to them, but it doesn't actually tell you anything other than their name, like, and their portrait. I don't know if that's just because it's the demo. Maybe the flavor text hasn't been added yet. You also get a camera that lets you take pictures of enemies, and I could not figure out where you stash those pictures. Also, when you're in the menu, you've got the icons at the top that let you swap between sections of the menu, but then when you go down into the list of things underneath each of those headings, there's no button that just navigates you back to the top. You have to manually scroll back to the top, even though you can press L and R to go down or up a page. I just thought it was kind of clunky and a very easy thing to change. Maybe this will be different in the finished version of the game as well. It's hard to know. Overall, I thought this was fun enough to play through it twice, but I came pretty close to giving up on the boss the second time I went through the game. There was something satisfying about going back through the dungeon, knowing what I was doing this time, and being able to just knock stuff out really quickly, even though there were still two places where I had forgotten where a specific small key is and kind of had to go run around in search of it and then realized, oh, of course. And my first time playing, there were a couple of puzzles that had genuinely stumped me for a little bit before I, had a similar realization of kind of walking into the right room where the answer was and going, oh, right, how could I forget this? I think if you're the type of person who generally doesn't like Zelda puzzles, you will not like this game. It is no better than Zelda at the puzzle aspect. It is really along the same lines. But if you like Zelda puzzles, if you like Zelda dungeons, I think that you will like traveling this dungeon, solving its puzzles. I think some of the mechanics are interesting. I even think that mechanically the boss fight is an interesting battle. It's just that the jumping aspect being added into it really pissed me off. Like, the number of times I died just because of that. It's weird because in the first part of the fight, the boss is throwing all these ads at you that drop hearts. And so if you fall off the ledge during that first part, it's fairly easy to get your health back. But then in the second and third phase of the battle, there is no way to get health back, and the boss is firing at you way more quickly. Now, in the third phase, you don't actually have to jump over anything. You just have to dodge arrows and the boss at the same time and use your cloning technique. And in that part, it's only frustrating because the window of time you have to clone and place your object is so small in between the boss firing at you, and you can slash the boss's attack to dismiss it, but it's a little bit confusing what angle you have to be standing at to make that happen. So overall, again, this boss just frustrated me more than it was fun to beat. It was the kind of thing where I was desperate to be done with it, and when I hit it the final time and it finally died, I was like, oh, thank God. Another thing I found strange is that when you beat the boss, you actually get a key to go into another room in the dungeon. And I kind of like that in Zelda, you just beat the boss and the dungeon is over. You don't have to be there anymore. In this game, it's like you have to run back through, unlock this other door, and then you enter a room that's got all these enemies in it, but you don't end up fighting the enemies. You just kind of teleport into another room where a cutscene happens. That felt very strange. At the end, the game asks you to make a decision, one of which is obviously the correct decision and the other which is not. I made the incorrect decision for the sake of the footage, and all it does is give you a bad ending and then reset you to right before the decision, so there is no long-term consequences. You literally just lose and start over if you make that decision. I guess it's cute that they gave you that choice at all, but it is kind of pointless. Overall, I still feel relatively positively about this game. I did wishlist it, but I don't see myself making a day one purchase on it unless I were to watch someone else's playthrough and find that there was something really interesting later on. I would honestly be checking to make sure there's no jumping. Like, I honestly would be like, if I see too much jumping, I'm not buying this game. If I look at the full version of it, maybe you won't care about the jumping at all and you'll be totally content with that, and it won't bother you, in which case, I think if you look at this game and you think you'll like it, you probably will, and it might be worth checking out. Full game comes out in like 2 weeks as of the time of this recording. So whether or not I talk about the full game will depend on how I feel watching other people play it. But for now, that's my review. Thank you for watching. This is Radiant Precious Gems, where I talk about indie RPGs. I have other channels talking about shmups and action games and cozy games and a gamer hot takes channel. All of that's linked below, along with all my other channels on my link tree. Thank you for listening, and never forget, Radiant Precious Gems forever.